Her best friend, the bridesmaid at her wedding, had been secretly having an affair with her husband for years. Emma Watson did not just lose a marriage, she lost her trust in the very people who stood closest to her. But from that betrayal, she turned pain into power and rose stronger than ever before. The morning sunlight filtered through the linen curtains, casting soft golden shadows on the white walls of the Watson household. In the quiet kitchen, Emma stood barefoot on the tiled floor, hands loosely wrapped around a ceramic mug of chamomile tea. Her movements were gentle, deliberate, like someone afraid of disturbing a fragile peace. She always rose early, long before Gabriel stirred. That hour before dawn belonged solely to her, a sliver of solitude she had come to cherish, though she never said it aloud. Emma Watson was a woman of quiet presence. Her beauty was not loud, not the kind that turned heads on the street, but the kind that settled slowly into a room and stayed there. In the softness of her voice, the patience of her gaze, the careful way she listened to others. There was a warmth to her that made people trust her too quickly, speak too openly because Emma never judged. She had a heart that gave easily and expected little in return. Years ago, she had been a painter, not a famous one, not even a particularly ambitious one, but her canvases had been filled with color and emotion. The brush had been her second language. But when she fell in love with Gabriel, that world had quietly dimmed. Not because he demanded it, not because he forbade it, but because Emma, in her nature, gave herself entirely to the things she loved. And she loved Gabriel deeply, so she tucked her easels away, rolled up her unfinished works, and traded the chaos of paint for the calm rhythm of domestic life. Gabriel was everything Emma had dreamed of: composed, intelligent, articulate, a man who seemed to carry the weight of his own world with ease. He ran a firm that dealt with international clients and contracts Emma never asked too much about. She trusted him, not out of naivety, but out of the belief that love, when true, did not require interrogation. Their marriage appeared to outsiders as a picture of success: elegant dinners, holiday cards sent on time, laughter shared over wine at the end of long days. Emma played her part gracefully, never resenting it. "Do you ever miss it?" Gabriel had asked her once, years ago, when he caught her looking at an old sketchbook in the attic. Her fingers had lingered over a charcoal portrait. Unfinished, a woman's eyes caught mid-expression. She had smiled. "Not really," she said. "That life feels like someone I used to know." He kissed her forehead, pleased, and the conversation ended there. She told herself it was enough. Emma believed in love the way others believed in gravity, an invisible force, constant and binding. She believed in soft silences, in shared coffee, in the power of two people choosing each other every day. She never questioned the ease of their life together. Gabriel left in the morning with a polished briefcase and a kiss on her cheek. She cleaned the house, managed the groceries, wrote thank-you notes on linen stationery. The days blended into one another, serene and predictable. No, she never doubted the world she lived in. Not once, not until much later. That afternoon, as the golden hush of late spring settled over the quiet neighborhood, Emma stood by the open window in the living room, folding freshly laundered linens into precise squares. Outside, the garden she tended bloomed in neat rows: lavender, peonies, a stubborn patch of rosemary she had nursed through a harsh winter. The air smelled of soil and sunlight. Everything looked perfect, from the soft hum of the dishwasher to the faint classical music drifting from the old radio on the counter. It was the kind of life most people would envy. Their home, a pale stone house with climbing ivy and tall windows, had once been featured in a lifestyle magazine. Refined, elegant, serene, the article had described it, much like the couple themselves. Gabriel with his pressed shirts and quiet charm, and Emma with her modest grace and effortless hospitality were the embodiment of balance. At dinners, guests would comment on their dynamic, how well they complemented each other, how lucky they were to have found something so rare. Emma always smiled, thanked them, and changed the subject. And yet behind that smile, something small and persistent had begun to stir. She would catch herself staring at her reflection a little too long, not with vanity, but with unfamiliarity, as if trying to remember who she had been before Mrs. Watson became her name. She no longer painted, no longer stayed up late to scribble poems in the margins of books. Her hands, once stained with oils and ink, now stayed clean, too clean. And though she told herself she was content, the silence that came when Gabriel was away on his frequent business trips had started to stretch, not just in hours, but in meaning. There were moments, small ones, easily dismissed, that left tiny cracks in the polished surface of their life. Gabriel had become quieter at home. His phone vibrated late into the evening, messages he never explained. He spent more time away, his explanations always logical, his tone always calm. Emma asked, gently at first, but learned to stop. He would smile and brush a kiss against her forehead, just like he always did. "You worry too much, my love," he said one night as he packed for a conference in Geneva. "You know how demanding the firm is." She nodded. Of course she knew. She always knew. She helped him prepare his passport, folded his shirts just the way he liked them. She did not tell him that the scent of his cologne on her pillow no longer brought comfort. She did not tell him that the meals she prepared alone tasted less like care and more like routine. The illusion held, to their neighbors, to their friends, even to her own family. Emma played her part with the same quiet precision she brought to every corner of their life. She sent out thank you cards. She watered the roses. She laughed at the right moments. But at night, when the house was still and the garden shadows crept across the floor, she would sit with a book open on her lap, eyes unfocused, her mind drifting back to half-finished canvases, to forgotten sketches hidden in the attic, to the woman she used to be. And though she told herself this was what happiness looked like, a quiet doubt had begun to whisper beneath the silence. She told herself not to listen. She told herself it was nothing. It was a Tuesday afternoon, the kind where the world felt still enough to suggest nothing could possibly go wrong. Emma had spent the morning in the garden, her hands buried in soil, coaxing a row of young violets to take root. She came inside with dirt under her nails and sunlight in her hair, humming absently as she peeled off her gloves and poured herself a glass of water. The house was quiet, too quiet. The kind of silence that waits, poised, before unraveling. The email had arrived the night before. She had ignored it at first, a message from a bank she did not recognize, subject line marked urgent final notice. Spam, she thought. Another phishing attempt. But something about the wording gnawed at her. Now, with the cursor hovering over the subject, her stomach tightened. She clicked. There were pages attached. Contracts, signatures, scanned copies of financial documents bearing her full name, a loan application for an investment fund in Singapore, another for a property in Prague. Emma blinked, her mouth dry. She did not remember signing anything. Her hands trembled as she scrolled. It was all there, her name, her forged signature, her identification number. Gabriel's name appeared only once, on a recommendation letter. He had written it himself. The wording was clinical, distant. My wife, Emma Watson, has consistently demonstrated financial acumen and discretion. A lie so elegant, it read like the truth. The betrayal settled over her like dust in a forgotten room. But it was only the beginning. Later that evening, she opened Gabriel's laptop, something she had never done before. Not out of suspicion, but because trust had always been her quiet default. The screen was unlocked. She did not know what she was looking for. She only knew that something primal, had cracked open inside her.
The first message was from Claire.
Claire. It took her a moment to believe what she was seeing. The name alone caused a weight to settle in her chest. Claire, the woman who had held Emma's hand through college breakups, the one who had stood behind her in pale lilac silk the day she married Gabriel. Claire, her oldest friend, her bridesmaid, her sister in everything but blood. The emails stretched back years, not just late-night messages or fleeting apologies, but entire conversations steeped in familiarity, in intimacy. Photographs, jokes, plans. They had vacationed together. Paris, quietly. Rome, secretly. Emma stared at the dates. Some of them coincided with Gabriel's business trips. She read them all, her breath ragged, her face expressionless. Her heart made no sound as it broke. It simply ceased to beat with trust. When Gabriel came home that night, she said nothing at first. She watched him move through the kitchen, loosen his tie, pour a glass of wine. Then, in a voice colder than she thought herself capable of, she asked, "How long has it been?" He froze. The glass paused halfway to his lips. "What are you talking about?" "Claire," she said, "and the loans." Silence. It stretched so long she could hear the ticking of the kitchen clock. He did not deny it. Not at first. Not convincingly. Words came, but they were brittle and meaningless. Complications, misunderstandings, things he would explain. She did not listen. The following days collapsed in chaos. Legal documents arrived. She was being sued. Creditors, banks, lawyers with unfamiliar names. Her accounts were frozen. The house, their beautiful home, was no longer hers to hold. Her name had been weaponized. Her trust had been leveraged. Gabriel left. Not in anger, not in shame, but with an odd, practiced detachment, like someone stepping off a train he never meant to stay on. He packed quietly. No apology, no regret. Just the smooth mask of a man who had already rewritten the narrative in his mind. Emma stood by the window long after his car disappeared from view, unable to cry. The weight of everything, the lies, the debt, the abandonment, settled in her bones like winter. The silence she once cherished now echoed like a warning she had failed to hear, and for the first time in her life she realized she was truly, utterly alone. The days that followed bled into one another, shapeless and gray, as if the world had forgotten to turn its face toward the sun. Emma moved through them like a ghost, unseeing, untouched, unmoored. The once pristine house was emptied, piece by piece, until nothing familiar remained. She left the keys with the bank official without ceremony, walked away with 2 suitcases, and did not look back. She found a small apartment on the edge of the city, a 4th-floor flat with a leaking faucet, a window that overlooked the back wall of a grocery store, and walls thin enough to hear the arguments of strangers. It was not home. It was shelter. The silence there was no longer gentle. It pressed on her like a weight. She stopped answering calls, stopped opening the blinds. Even the air felt heavier, thick with things unsaid. The tabloids had gotten hold of the story. Wife of high-profile financier at center of scandal. And overnight, her name became something to whisper behind closed doors. She had once been known in quiet, elegant circles, admired for her grace, her restraint. Now she was a headline, a symbol of naivety. A woman too stupid to know her husband had destroyed her. Friends fell away without confrontation, like leaves in late autumn. Some were polite enough to disappear silently. Others sent clipped messages of vague concern, laced with distance. Even her family, those who had once cherished her gentleness, began to ask questions not with empathy, but with suspicion. Her sister called one evening, voice tight and rehearsed. "Emma, how could you not know? I mean, these are serious charges. This isn't just—" She hesitated. "This isn't just heartbreak." Emma said nothing. There was nothing to say. The silence that followed was not disagreement, but disconnection. A gentle severing of ties she thought unbreakable. She ate less, slept rarely. Nights stretched long and airless, haunted by dreams she could not remember, and mornings she did not want. Some days she would sit for hours on the edge of the bed, unable to move, unable to speak, her hands curled into fists she did not notice. Her body remained, but her mind wandered somewhere distant and dark, and yet, somewhere beneath the ruin, something waited. It began as all revivals do, in the smallest of ways. One morning, Emma reached for a notebook she had packed without thinking. A soft leather journal, blank and untouched. She opened to the first page. Her hand hovered over it for a long time before moving. The lines that emerged were clumsy, unfocused, but they were hers. She wrote a single sentence. "I do not know who I am now, but I will not stay this version forever." Then she closed the book. The next day she wrote again, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the act of reaching inward became an act of reaching forward. Something quiet stirred beneath the grief, not hope, not yet, but the memory of it. A shape without form, a rhythm returning to her chest. She was still broken, but now she was listening. The transformation did not come with fanfare. It came quietly, in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday, when Emma stood staring at a pale shaft of morning light falling across the kitchen floor. There was something in its stillness that reminded her of a studio she had once known, a studio filled with turpentine, cracked palettes, and the smell of oils she used to mix without thinking. Her fingers itched, not with certainty, but with memory. Later that day, she found herself in the back of a thrift shop on a forgotten street, rummaging through a box of discarded art supplies. There was a worn canvas, a dented tin of brushes, and a half-empty set of paints with broken lids. She bought them all without hesitation, as if obeying a voice that had not spoken in years. In the corner of her apartment, the only corner that caught natural light after 2 p.m, she set up her first makeshift studio. No one knew, no one needed to. It was hers. The first canvas sat blank for 3 days. She watched it like it might speak. When she finally picked up the brush, her hand trembled. The stroke she made was harsh, angry, almost violent, a slash of crimson against white. She did not stop. Colors poured out of her, not carefully arranged, but torn from somewhere deep. Shadows, fractures, flame. The pain came first, then the grief, then unexpectedly, the outlines of a face she had forgotten how to paint, her own. Not as she had been, but as she was now. Raw, hollowed, awake. She painted through the nights, often barefoot, sometimes in silence, sometimes to the pulse of music that matched her heartbeat. She stopped waiting for clarity. The act of painting was clarity. It was the only place where she could make sense of what had happened without needing words. Days turned into weeks. Her apartment grew cluttered with canvases leaned against the walls, with colors that bled beyond their frames. She painted without purpose, without audience, and for the first time in years, without permission. It was not beautiful, not always, but it was alive. One afternoon, while browsing a small independent bookstore, she struck up a conversation with the man at the register after noticing the sketch pinned behind him. A charcoal study of a cathedral roof under construction. "You drew this?" she asked. He smiled, brushing a hand over his graying beard. "Once upon a time." They talked longer than expected. His name was Lucas. He owned the gallery 2 doors down, though he claimed he rarely opened it anymore. "Art's a lonely business," he said. "But sometimes, the lonely ones make the best things." Emma did not tell him her story. She did not need to. He seemed to recognize something in her. Not pity, not curiosity, but a kind of quiet recognition only artists shared. A week later, she brought in one of her paintings. It was the first one she had finished, an abstract piece with jagged edges and a line of gold running like a scar through a sea of bruised blue. Lucas stood in front of it for a long time, silent. "Would you let me show this?" he asked finally. "Not because it is polished, but because it breathes." She felt the answer before she spoke it. Yes. It was not a return, it was a beginning, a different one. And when she walked home that evening, the wind was sharp against her face, the city loud and unsentimental. But she moved through it with steadier steps, no longer shrinking from its gaze. She was painting again, and this time she was not waiting to be seen. The gallery's walls were still bare the morning Emma arrived to help Lucas prepare for the opening. Light filtered through tall, dust-specked windows, and the scent of turpentine lingered in the air like a quiet memory. She moved between frames with a calm precision, her fingers adjusting the edges of her work, now properly mounted, catalogued, and titled. Each canvas felt like a piece of skin she had shed. She did not yet know what people would say, or if they would come at all. But it no longer mattered. This was no longer about being understood. It was about claiming the space she had once abandoned. But as she stepped back from one of the final pieces, her gaze caught a folder resting beneath her coat on the front bench, the lawyer's envelope, cream-colored, unassuming, heavy in a way that paper should never be. It had been sitting there for 2 days. Emma stared at it, unmoving. She had spent months avoiding anything that carried Gabriel's name, anything tied to the legal wreckage he had left behind. But survival, the kind that was more than breath and hunger, demanded reckoning. She picked up the envelope and carried it home, her steps deliberate, her breath steady. That evening, she poured a glass of water, turned off the music, and sat down at the kitchen table with nothing but the folder before her. Page by page, she read. The loans were vast, scattered across 3 countries. Her name was on every line, cleanly forged. Gabriel had used her trust like a key, opening doors to accounts she never knew existed. Dates, amounts, witnesses, and at the heart of it all, silence. Every signature had been a theft, every document a lie. She needed help. It was Lucas again who handed her a name. Julia Farron, he said, tapping his fingers thoughtfully against his mug of coffee. Used to be with a corporate law firm downtown. Left it all after a scandal that would have buried someone else. She's the kind who remembers what drowning feels like. Emma hesitated. Why would she take my case? Lucas shrugged. Because she knows what it's like to be robbed while smiling. Just talk to her. They met in a small cafe that smelled of cardamom and dark roast. Julia arrived early, tall, striking, composed. There was nothing polished about her, and yet she seemed carved from the same fire Emma had only just begun to feel within herself. I read the documents, Julia said after they had exchanged only a few words, and I believe you. It was not a performance. It was not sympathy. It was fact. Emma felt something break open. Not fear, not relief, but the beginning of something that resembled power. The fight was long. Calls, depositions, legal letters, red ink corrections, names Emma had never heard that now haunted her dreams. Gabriel refused to cooperate. His lawyers buried them in paperwork. There were nights when Emma sat on the floor, her back against the radiator, the apartment dark except for the laptop's glow. Doubt circled like vultures. There will be days when this feels impossible, Julia warned her, but we will outlast them. And they did, because Emma no longer asked permission to be believed. She read everything. She asked questions. She stood in meetings and spoke with a voice that no longer wavered. The woman who had once folded napkins with trembling care now stood before corporate attorneys and demanded accountability. The city did not change for her. It was still cold, still indifferent. But she was no longer shrinking from it. Each legal step felt like reclaiming another part of herself, not just as a victim, but as a force, one that had been quiet too long. In the weeks leading up to the exhibition, the gallery transformed into something unrecognizable, a space no longer filled with hesitant sketches and borrowed frames, but with bold shapes, fractured colors, and canvases that radiated a quiet defiance. Emma worked late into the nights, often side by side with Lucas, who offered guidance only when asked. He knew better than to shape what was already becoming its own voice. The exhibition was titled Shattered Mirrors. The name came to her one morning while brushing her hair. A simple act, interrupted when the brush slipped from her hand and struck the edge of the bathroom mirror. The crack it left ran like a scar across her reflection, and for a moment, she did not move. She simply stared at the distorted version of herself and thought, this is what survival looks like. She wrote it down. It became the heart of the show. Each piece on display was born of a wound, raw, unsanitized, and deeply intimate. There was a portrait of a faceless woman caught mid-fall, her limbs dissolving into ink. Another, painted entirely in shades of blue, pulsed with the quiet loneliness of betrayal. But not every canvas mourned. Some pulsed with fire. Orange and crimson strokes carved into black. Others shimmered with gold leaf, tracing through broken shapes, delicate and luminous, like light escaping through cracks. Word spread slowly at first. A journalist who had once written about her only in the context of Gabriel's downfall asked to visit the gallery ahead of the opening. Emma hesitated, but agreed. The article that followed was not what she expected. Emma Watson no longer waits to be introduced, it read. She introduces herself, in oil, in blood, in gold. After that, things changed. People came. Not in crowds, not at first, but steadily, insistently. Artists, survivors, strangers. Some left notes, some cried. One woman stood in front of the central piece, a jagged self-portrait layered with ash and silver, for nearly an hour before turning to Emma and saying, "This is how it felt. You gave it a shape." She had no idea how to answer that, so she said thank you and meant it more deeply than she could explain. Soon the media's language began to shift. She was no longer mentioned in passing as the woman Gabriel Watson had once been married to. She was Emma Watson, artist. Her name, once swallowed in someone else's shadow, now stood on its own. Not cleaned or perfected, but true. Julia came to the gallery one evening, coat still damp from the rain. She paused in front of the final painting, a small canvas titled The Quiet Rebellion. It was simple. A table, an open window, and a pair of bare feet resting on the edge. But the light in it was unmistakable. "You built this," Julia said softly. "Not just the art, all of it." Emma nodded. "I needed to see who I really was, without him. And now everyone else sees it too." The gallery hummed with voices behind them, laughter, conversation, quiet footfalls. Emma looked out across the space and saw not a room full of paintings, but a room full of mirrors. Not the kind that reflected faces, but the kind that revealed truths people had spent their whole lives hiding from. She was no longer invisible. And more importantly, she no longer needed to be seen to believe she existed. But standing there, amid the colors that had once lived only in her pain, she felt something she had not felt in a long time: belonging. The courtroom smelled faintly of paper and old wood polish, the air dry and clinical, stripped of sentiment. Emma sat at the plaintiff's table beside Julia, her posture composed, her breath measured. It had taken months to reach this moment, months of files and filings, of late-night strategy calls, of doubt curled like smoke in her chest. Now everything was reduced to silence and procedure. The sound of shuffling papers, the clicking of heels against tile, voices dropped to whispers, time suspended. Gabriel entered the room as if he still believed it was his. His suit was perfect, as always. His expression, controlled, neutral, carried the faintest trace of amusement, as if this were all some regrettable inconvenience he had every intention of brushing aside. He did not look at Emma, not once. She did not expect him to. He had built his life on the illusion of inevitability, of charm so polished it repelled consequence. But this time, charm would not be enough. The first hour was clinical, transactional, documents were reviewed, witnesses identified. Emma's name was read aloud over and over again, detached and formal, until it barely sounded like hers anymore. But then came the shift. The man who took the stand was older than she remembered, his voice rough with discomfort, his hands slightly shaking as he adjusted his glasses. He had been Gabriel's associate once, someone Emma had seen at parties, someone who had smiled at her over wine and canapes and told her she was lucky. He did not smile now. "I was told to draw up the paperwork under her name," he said, his voice steadying. Gabriel insisted she was aware of everything. But I suspected. I asked him twice. He said she was too emotional to be involved directly, that he'd take care of it. Julia leaned in slightly. Did she ever sign anything in front of you? No, the man replied, never. It unraveled quickly after that. The forged signatures, the hidden accounts, the pattern of manipulation so precise it became undeniable. Piece by piece, the lie Gabriel had constructed fell apart, not with a crash, but with the quiet certainty of facts aligning, impossible to ignore. Emma did not speak throughout the proceedings. She watched. She listened. When the defense tried to reduce her to a naive housewife, Julia countered with calm, searing logic. When photographs were produced of Gabriel's travels with Claire, under the guise of business trips, Emma's gaze did not waver. And when Gabriel finally took the stand, his voice was still smooth, still measured. She knew, he said. She was my wife. Of course she knew. But the words lacked conviction. There was a crack in his veneer, subtle but visible, a hesitation, a flicker in his eye when faced with the very documents he had signed without her. For the first time, he looked less like the man who had once ruled her world and more like what he truly was, small, cornered, unraveling. As the judge reviewed the final statements, the room fell into a hush, heavy enough to feel solid. Emma looked at Gabriel then, really looked. The man who had once drawn her into a life of whispered promises and quiet betrayals now sat with his hands clenched in his lap, eyes fixed on nothing. She did not hate him. Hate would have meant she still carried him somewhere inside her. What she felt instead was distance, the kind of cold, clear space that follows a storm when the wreckage has already been counted and named. Gabriel was no longer the center of her collapse. He was simply a man, flawed, afraid, and finally forced to face himself in a room that no longer bent to his charm. When the verdict was read and the truth declared, Emma did not cry. She stood slowly, offered Julia a quiet nod of gratitude, and walked out of the courtroom with her shoulders unbowed. She had not just survived him, she had outlived the version of herself that once believed he was everything. The rain had been falling for hours, steady and unbroken, a quiet percussion against the window panes of the gallery. Emma stood by the back door, a cup of lukewarm tea in her hands, watching water ripple across the cobblestones. The storm outside mirrored none of the clarity she felt within. The trial was over, the judgment final. Her name was restored, her record clean. Gabriel had been ordered to pay restitution, his reputation left in tatters. And yet, victory did not arrive with trumpets. It arrived like silence, steady and vast. The knock at the front door came just after twilight. Lucas had already gone home, the gallery locked for the night. Emma crossed the empty room slowly, the soles of her boots quiet against the wooden floor. Through the glass she saw him, standing there in the rain without an umbrella, coat soaked through, his hair darker and flatter than she remembered. Gabriel. She hesitated only a moment before unlocking the door. He stepped inside without waiting for permission, the scent of rain trailing behind him. For a moment, they stood across from each other in the gallery's dim light, surrounded by the echoes of her paintings. Her story, told in shape and shadow. I wanted to talk, he said, his voice lower now, no longer polished with performance. Emma said nothing. I made mistakes, he continued, avoiding her eyes. Terrible ones. I let everything fall apart, but She raised a hand, not angrily, just firmly. If you came to apologize, say the words. Gabriel swallowed. I was scared. I thought I was going to lose everything. And I did. But maybe we could try again. I know it's a lot to ask, but we had something. Once. Emma looked at him, really looked, and saw not the man she had once married, not the phantom that had haunted her nights, but someone altogether smaller, not cruel, not evil, just deeply, ruinously selfish, and still, even now, trying to bend the world back to his liking. I fought for months to undo what you did, she said softly. Not just the loans, not just the lies, but the version of myself you tried to leave behind. And now that you've lost, You want to rewrite the ending?" His shoulders sagged. Water dripped from his cuffs onto the floor. "You were always kinder than I deserved." "No," she said. "I was always quieter than you noticed." He blinked at that, as though the words had landed somewhere he had never been willing to see. A long silence stretched between them. She could feel the weight of her choice before it arrived, not like a sharp turn, but like a slow closing of a door she had been holding open far too long. "I forgive you," she said at last. The words surprised her with their warmth. They did not taste bitter. They did not tremble. "But that doesn't mean I'll forget, and it doesn't mean we go back." Gabriel looked away, jaw tightening, as if preparing himself for something final. "I'm not forgiving you for you," she continued. "I'm doing it for me, so I can walk away without dragging your shadow with me." She turned, walked toward the gallery door, and held it open. The rain had not let up. It whispered across the pavement like a quiet applause. Gabriel hesitated, then stepped outside without another word. Emma watched him disappear into the curtain of water. Then she shut the door, locked it, and stood for a moment in the hush that followed. The air felt clearer, her chest lighter. Forgiveness, she realized, was not surrender. It was release. And tonight she was free. The sea greeted her like an old friend she had forgotten she was waiting for. Emma stepped out of the car and stood still for a long moment, her eyes fixed on the horizon where the water met the sky in a line so clean it looked drawn by hand. The salt air curled around her skin, sharp and honest. Behind her, the small cottage waited. Whitewashed walls, a red door, windows that faced east to catch the morning light. It was simple, unassuming, perfect. She'd signed the lease 2 weeks after the trial ended. There was no dramatic farewell to the city, no announcement of departure. Just a quiet decision made over a cup of tea and a page torn from her notebook. It read only one thing: start again, where the sky feels bigger. The coastal town was slower, humbler. The people at the corner cafe learned her name by the second day. The grocer gave her extra lemons without asking. Strangers smiled as they passed. She rented a sunlit studio a few streets from the harbor, with high ceilings and floorboards that creaked like old wood should. She painted in silence, often barefoot, often with music playing from an old radio balanced on a paint-splattered stool. It was not escape, it was return. One morning, as she rinsed brushes by the open window, her phone rang. An unfamiliar number. She almost ignored it, but something in her gut said answer. "Emma." Julia's voice came through, steady as ever, but softer now. "I've been thinking, there are women out there, like us. Too many. I want to start something, a place where they can breathe, where they're believed. I do not want to do it alone." Emma closed her eyes for a moment, the sea humming in the distance. "I am listening," she said. And so it began. Not a foundation, not a crusade, but something real. A space built from ruin, where women walked in with broken voices and left with sharpened ones. Emma lent her story, not as spectacle, but as solidarity. Her canvases hung in the main room, not as decoration, but as declaration. She did not need to speak often. Her presence spoke for itself, and in the quiet hours, she returned to her studio. There was no audience, no pressure, just canvas and color and the soft hush of waves beyond the open window. She painted not to prove she had survived, but to show she had become. No longer wife, no longer victim, no longer anyone's mirror. She was Emma Watson, and she belonged only to herself. The invitation came in a white envelope, elegant and unadorned, except for a small embossed crest in the corner. The mark of one of Europe's most respected contemporary art biennales. Emma opened it slowly, almost absently, expecting nothing. But as her eyes moved across the lines of formal type, her breath caught. They had chosen her. Not just one piece, but her name, Emma Watson, listed among a curated group of artists from around the world. The theme of the exhibition was transformation through fracture. She smiled at the quiet irony. It was, in every sense, a language she now spoke fluently. She shipped the piece herself, packed it with care as if sending away a part of her body, which in many ways it was. Titled Broken Petals, the canvas was wide and spare, with muted tones that swelled into a burst of color at the center. At first glance, it seemed delicate, soft, almost fragile. But the longer one looked, the more strength emerged. Each brushstroke carried tension and resolve, as if the painting itself had been stitched together from something that once refused to live. The petals, fractured and imperfect, did not fold inward. They reached out. Emma arrived in Berlin the day before the opening, traveling alone. She checked into a quiet hotel near the river and spent the evening walking without destination, letting the city's unfamiliar rhythm fold gently around her. She did not feel like a visitor. She felt like a witness to her own becoming. The gallery was quiet when she entered the next morning, hours before the crowd. White walls, clean light. She moved slowly past the installations, her heels muffled on the concrete floor. When she reached her own piece, she stopped. It stood simply. No spotlight, no pedestal, just canvas and space. Beside it, the placard bore her name and the title, Broken Petals. Beneath it, in her own handwriting, printed exactly as she had requested, were the words, "Broken does not mean the end. Some things must first fall apart before they can shine." She did not stay beside the painting. She walked through the rest of the gallery, watched other people watching. Faces she did not know paused in front of her work, lingering. A few took photos. A man stood with his arms crossed, silent, unmoving. A young woman wiped her cheek, turned away quietly. Emma sat in the far corner of the space, a cup of coffee in her hands, unseen. It was the way she liked it. She had not painted to be understood. She had painted to survive. And in surviving, she had found something far greater than closure. She had found expression, shape, purpose. Broken Petals would hang there for 6 weeks. Then it would travel to Paris, then Tokyo. She might follow, or she might stay by the sea, where the light was kinder and the silence no longer frightened her. Either way, the art would speak in her place. She did not need to raise her voice. The world was already listening.